after 4 years of Trump, do you think he did more good for the country or bad, especially after the January 6th insurrection that happened? I mean,
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I don't think it was an insurrection because I think an insurrection is an attempt to overthrow the government by violent means. And none of the people who were arrested even were armed inside the Capitol. So I think that's an example of a misuse of language to shut down discussion more than to open up discussion.
welcome back to Gen Z Speaks. Our guest today is Professor Scott Soames. Professor Scott Soames is a professor of philosophy at USC, where he chairs the department. He's a graduate of Stanford University, where he received his degree in philosophy. Then he went on to MIT, where he received his PhD in linguistics and philosophy. And he formerly taught at Princeton University from 1980 to 2004. And he's been teaching at USC since 2004. Professor Scott Soames is the author of numerous books. His recent books include The World Philosophy Made, in addition to a couple others. We're so happy to have you, Professor. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So my first question to you is, you've had a prolific career in philosophy, and in the current day and age, why do you think philosophy matters, and what is the importance of philosophy to you?
I think the importance of philosophy today is pretty much the same as it's always been. There are periods of time in which it's more important than others because of the nature of the societies at that time. But the basic aspirations of philosophy, I think, remain constant, and they have remained constant for over 2,000 years in the West. That's a long time. One of the main aims has always been, since ancient Greek philosophy, to contribute to the foundations of theoretical knowledge of absolutely all kinds. And you will realize that if you go back and read Aristotle and see what he has to say about logic, about physics, about biology, about political science, about rhetoric, and the rest. And if you go up through the centuries, you will see similar things of that kind, sometimes from pure philosophers, sometimes from people who are combinations of philosophers and scientists. Galileo was one of the latter. He, of course, was a great astronomer. He discovered also laws of acceleration. But he also developed a comprehensive philosophical conception of nature. And then you go beyond him, you get to Descartes. He was both a mathematician and a philosopher. He gave us the foundations of analytic geometry. He developed hypotheses about biology, mechanistic hypotheses. And then, of course, in the dialogues, he contrasted all that with the mysteries of human consciousness and human reason. And you just go on and on. Go to the UK. David Hume was, among many other things, a precursor to Darwin. In fact, Darwin's grandfather was his student, and who read all his books and gave them to his grandson, Charles, with the admonition that he read them. And if you compare certain parts of Hume's dialogues on natural religion with Darwin's evolutionary theory, you'll see the seeds of the ideas, some of them were right there. Who else did we have at that time? Good friend of David Hume, Adam Smith. You think of Adam Smith as the founder of modern economics. Well, he was the founder of modern, or one of them. But he also was the holder of the chair in moral science and moral philosophy at Glasgow University. And he wrote prodigiously on that subject. You keep moving forward and you get to a mathematician in the mid to late 19th century, Gottlieb Frege, who was interested in philosophical questions. What are numbers and how do we arrive at knowledge of them? Those are philosophical questions. So what did he do in response? A variety of things. He developed modern symbolic logic. Then Bertrand Russell followed in his footsteps. Then we had a set in the 1920s and 1930s of philosophical logicians, Gödel, Tarski, and Church, and then Alan Turing, all more or less in collaboration with each other, developed mathematical theories of computational functions that led directly to the first computers, and hence to the digital age. You get to say probability and rational decision theory. They were thought up by Frank Ramsey, a young philosopher in the late 1920s, and by my colleague at Princeton, Dick Jeffrey, who taught for decades and helped founded subjective probability theory. So that's one just set of things contributing to the foundations of theoretical knowledge. And we could go further. We could talk about other scientific disciplines, physics and the like, but that just gives you an idea. Now, this enterprise of developing theories of the world and also of ourselves is not going to stop. And a discipline that has made these kinds of contributions will continue to make them. So there's nothing special in that respect about this day and age. Philosophers will continue to do that, and they're doing that now. Now,
go ahead, Professor.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I've taken back, well, I'm in college still, right? But I took a few philosophy courses. Majority of them were ethics courses. And it just seems as if that the origin of philosophy was kind of, say, a sense of knowledge of everything. And philosophers really wanted to, just from the beginning, they wanted to know about everything, not just linguistics, but as you're saying, mathematics, physics, and the question has always been, always will be, why. And so it just seems that progressively it's become, philosophers have become less and less concerned with the knowledge of all and to be pretty sufficient at everything, and more towards linguistics and more towards why, as to why the way we speak, why do we speak a certain way, and such as that. Why do you think the progressive change has become to that, and why have things become so specialized? Like now there's physics and now there's mathematics, and if you do mathematics, you're not doing anything else. So I was just wondering as to why do you think the progressive change has developed like that?
Well, I'll tell you, specialization is one thing. What you mentioned as language and linguistics, that's a different thing, and that's progressing in somewhat the same spirit, but it got off track in the mid 20th century and tried to swallow up philosophy itself for about 3 or 4 decades. And it failed, and we now just see it as another area of inquiry that challenges us like the rest. But specialization, just think about it. I hired a few years ago a philosopher of physics, the guy who started philosophy and physics at Oxford University. And he came to USC for a few years. Now, fortunately, somebody else has stolen him away from us. But he had, and what you have to have if you're working in philosophy and physics today is you have to have 2 PhDs. You have to have a PhD in philosophy, and you have to have a PhD in physics. I have a friend at Princeton who was my colleague who had both. That's how it is if you're going to work at that level. You have to be able to interact with the most specialized theoretical physicists, but you also have to be able to try and put that into a larger perspective that is not always the perspective of the individual physicists. And that's what happens in these disciplines. Now we have philosophy and economics. We have a subject that one of my fields is philosophy of language. And The real scientific study of language has only gotten going during my adult lifetime. And basically what's happened is, at least in one or two particular subdomains, namely semantics and pragmatics, meaning basically, and communication, philosophers have provided and continue to provide the theoretical framework for that. But you can't just do it by reading the great books in philosophy. You've got to study the developing scientific theory at the same time. And any individual person can only do so much of that. You can't have, and I don't think we'll ever again see these large philosophical theories of everything of the kind that we saw in the distant past. We will see individual philosophers and groups of philosophers producing pictures of different areas of life, of knowledge, of reality, of ethics, and the like, but they'll be overlapping pictures. They won't be one big picture. That's a change, all right. But we're still heading in the same direction. It just takes more time, effort, and specialization to put together the different parts of the big picture that we're not constructing individually anymore. We're trying to construct it collectively.
Right. We're trying to split the work apart,
Yeah.
in a sense. Yeah. Professor, you mentioned that a lot of these great inventors, these great scientists were in a sense philosophers as well.
Yeah.
And I want to know how does just a regular person, or let's take example me. I'm a computer science student, and
Good.
I want to get into philosophy, right? I enjoy philosophy. I enjoy reading books about philosophy. But there's so many different subfields and so many different
That's right.
specializations of philosophy. It's hard to really understand, like, hey, what should I read or what should I do to kind of learn. Do you have like something to say to people, or some sort of guidelines to follow to really learn philosophy in a sense?
I just was asked by a guy who puts together collections of things, and they're collections called the 5 best books in. And he asked me if I wanted to do something, and if I did, what would my topic be? And my topic was the 5 best books for learning Western philosophy, what it is, and how to do it yourself.
Wow. Perfect question.
And if you go to my website, which just put in Google, put my name and put USC, and it'll take you to my website, and you will find the link to that. And so in addition to my choices for the 5 best books, at the beginning, because that was part of the way this guy sets up this site, there's a section that's basically, why should I listen to this guy about what are the 5 best? So I write down a little bit about myself, and I preview my most recent book, The World Philosophy Made. And if you pick that up and you get it, and you can read through, you don't have to read it all straight through at one sitting, but it will connect philosophy to all the other things that were going on at the various times and right up to today. So you've got to start. You can't just read the old texts and get a sense of where it's all going. You have got to read philosophy interacting with something else. And the something else can be a theoretical discipline. It can be computer science. It can be rational decision theory, subjective probability. It can be any of these things. It can be symbolic logic, because some of my chapters are about those things. But it's a combination of thinking about those things and learning a little bit about them and how they relate to larger philosophical questions. That's what we need to do. We need to answer your question. If philosophy is going to become meaningful and accessible to the people that need it today.
So, okay, so kind of piggybacking off of that, through like my discussions with friends and just colleagues and students in general, when I ever discuss philosophy, they always ask, I've always been interested, but where do I start? There's so much. And so personally for me, like I have always discussed either Platonic dualism, and I'll tell them to go ahead and research that and kind of go into depth about big T truth and big F form and why, right? But I'll also tell them to discuss ethics, and because I think ethics plays the biggest part in an average person's life. And why do I do certain things, and if I do this, is it important to me? And so my question to you is, do you for the average Joe, for the average student, what specific topic would help them become a better person if they're just interested in? Yes.
Well, I think studying morality and asking questions about the source of morality, not just what actions should you perform, but what's the whole enterprise of morality about? And how does it arise? Is it just a set of individual preferences that some people agree with and other people don't agree with? Is it something written into the nature of the universe? Well, it's hard to see how that would be. Or is it something about human nature? Something about the nature of the human species that has evolved over time. And one of the things, when you take that perspective, one of the things that you find out, and it just jumps out at you, is that we are born to be highly social animals. We are always interacting with each other. And there are successful forms of interacting, and there are less successful forms of interacting. And really what's happening is we have a certain biological basis which allows us to form attachments in which we care deeply about others. But initially, those attachments are just to the near and dear. And to step beyond that, we need the right kinds of social institutions so that people can interact in a voluntary way. And if they coordinate, everybody will be better off than before. And moreover, we have to want to coordinate, not just to get more stuff ourselves, but because we actually like the people we're interacting with. We don't want to let them down. We don't want them to think badly about us. And you start looking into the basis of morality in human biology, psychology, and sociology. That, I think, is where progress is made. And I try to say something about that in the last 2 chapters of my book.
You touched on something I think that's important about social institutions. And, I think, like Matt was saying, about the importance of studying morality and ethics gives you an understanding of your role in the interaction with social institutions, whether they be political, economic, etc. Um, Transitioning into our current world today, specifically in the United States, our political infrastructure, do you think, those in power embody those basic fundamental principles of morality and ethics? Obviously, our country was founded upon some of these principles, but obviously, our past isn't completely moral or ethic, right? I mean, we've been through a lot as a country, and we started off with the sin of slavery, but in this current day and age, do you have a more optimistic perspective of those in power, using these basic tenets of morality and ethics?
I think we're facing a real crisis. And I don't think the United States is the only country that is facing a real crisis. I think basically all of Western Europe, some countries more than others, like right now, France is in a crisis about as severe as we are. Italy is deeply divided. The UK is struggling along and trying to adapt to a world in which there is a divide in the UK. There is a divide between those you might call the elite or the well-off and those that are, not. They're working class, a lot of working class people. And there's a very sharp divide between these two groups, and British politics is being roiled by this divide. It doesn't quite know what to do with it. And we have a similar and quite severe problem. You go down, you look at perhaps the most advanced country in Latin America, Chile, is deeply divided between left and right now. And Peru, which for 3 decades had been making good progress, is in a real decline. Now, why? And what's to be done about it? Let's go back to what we're more familiar with, the United States. You look at statistics like working class wages since maybe 1975 to 2015, basically stagnant. And you look at our historical rate of growth, but then compare it to the rate of growth we've had since 2000, very subpar. You look at concentrations of really enormous wealth that can sometimes be used for not supporting, but even kind of undermining democratic processes. These are a real problem. Look at colleges. We have far more educated people, college-educated people, than we have ever had before. But we don't have the institutions to satisfy the expectations of those people. And when they spend 4 years and a lot of money in school and go out and can find very little that would match their expectations, it creates real problems. But I guess another thing I've probably got to say is we have made, go back 150 years, we have made such spectacular progress in what? In science, in wealth, in technology, in health, in longevity. In all of these respects, we're living in heaven right now compared to where people were living then. But you know what? We've come so far. We've come so fast. We've alleviated so many problems that people are bewildered. What's next? What's the next frontier? What can I contribute to? And moreover, they're confused. They're confused because so many of the patterns of human life, from marriage and the family to the community and where you work and all of that, and having lifelong friends throughout your life, those were reinforced by the conditions of life back then. We've changed those conditions. We don't know what marriage is anymore. We don't know what family is anymore. We don't know what the role of these central things are anymore. So it's a very perplexing time. It's a perplexing time because look at this. What are human beings? We are this species of animal that evolved on Earth. We have great energy and we have been bred to be terrific problem solvers, especially when confronted with existential crises about ourselves and those who are near and dear us. We're terrific at that. Hey, those kind of crises are not facing me. They're not facing you. We have a more collective, communal crisis, and we've kind of lost our bearings.
Professor, there's a lot to unpack there, what you said, and I think you touched on a couple important points. Going back to the point about wages for working class Americans being stagnant since the 1980s, right? And the wealth disparity has just increased. Like you said, we live in a golden age for some, but for others, things haven't really changed, and there's a lot of systemic problems in our country that can be attributed to that. In your mind, in regards to the economic question, why do you think there is such a wide, wealth inequality gap in the country? And do you think that's a natural result of just, the way capitalism works or our system works? Or do you think, government institutions have ignored the concerns of working class Americans?
Well, I think they've largely ignored the concerns for working class Americans. You look at the median income, the change in the median income, household income during George W. Bush's 8 years. I'm not blaming any particular politician. It's much deeper than that. It was something like $50 more after 8 years in adjusted income. You look at Barack Obama's 8 years. It was something like $125 more after it. This is not America's historical pattern. Now, in the first 3 years that Trump was in office, the median income went up $5,000. Of course, after that, we're in big trouble again. We were in trouble in the fourth year. We're in trouble now. Now, how is it going to sort out? I'm not wise enough or expert enough to know. But I know we should be aiming to enrich the lives of those people, or that's the wrong way of putting it, to get out of the way and let them enrich their lives in the way that they feel fit, and give them the opportunities to do that. That had been for a long time the hallmark of America. Whether it still is or can be brought back, I wish I could tell you.
I think, in my mind, what I personally attribute our economic struggles to is going back to the years of Ronald Reagan, and even kind of before, where we had this mentality of prioritizing, in my mind, the interests of businesses, right, without any repercussions for the working class Americans. For instance, right, I mean, you mentioned how both Democratic and Republican governments have kind of ignored the effects of trade deals, right, and how we operate.
No, I'm with you on that.
Right, and I think oftentimes, because businesses have more influence in politics, right, they have more of a voice, so their concerns, get to be heard more, and obviously they've got the big bucks. So if you're a politician running for office, you're obviously going to give more of your time of the day to someone who's contributing more to your campaign, right, than the average person who's not contributing. In my mind, I think it's also a lack of innovation in politics, where in my mind, at least on a federal level, right, I feel like there's a lot of people running for Congress who are kind of doing it for themselves, right, for their own career and ambition, and not so much to further the interests of the constituents they represent. I mean, they do some projects here and there to say, look, this is what I did, or they kind of blame that our country's so divided, it's not my fault. So if it's not, I mean, obviously, like you said, there's not one person to blame here or one administration, but as a country, right, where do we move forward in terms of dealing with this crisis and other crises where, to a lot of Americans, they're just tired of the way politics currently works, and they refuse to be part of the system. I mean, only 60% of people usually vote in elections, and in midterm elections, it's like 30 to 40%. So what in your mind is a potential way to remedy some of these problems?
I wish I could tell you a remedy. I can't sit here and tell you a remedy. That is really beyond anything that I can do. But I do think you talked about the trade deals and all that. Economics will tell you that it's fine to have an imbalance of trade
Mhm.
because it'll just mean that each country is doing whatever it is that it does relatively better than the other country does, and everybody will end up being better off. That's the classic defense of free trade. And it's not like I'm a big enemy of free trade or anything like that, but economies are not countries. Countries have economies, and economic forces are intertwined with cultural and social forces. And sometimes you have to protect different groups of people that are valued parts of your country and that have helped build your country, even if they can't learn to code. And they still have a lot to offer. They offered a lot in the past, and we got to find, I guess, we're all people who are educated quite highly. We have to find ways of seeing them, of portraying them, of writing about them, of interacting with them, which brings all of that out so that there's not a sense of us versus them. And I think those of us who are better off and more highly educated, we have a bit of an obligation to go out of our way to try and bridge that divide. And I'm very concerned that the federal bureaucracy doesn't seem to care about this.
Right. I think part of the problem is, like you said, that this isn't just a trend in the United States, it's in other countries, right? We see the rise of populism in countries like the United Kingdom, among others. And I think one common trend that I see here is that, like I said, going back to my point before about politicians, again, this is my opinion, I think that a lot of people who are just craving for power, use these frustrations to just further themselves. So in my mind, that was, you can attribute that candidacy to Donald Trump and what he promised people, right? I mean, there's stuff to be said about what he actually did in government, but I feel like he did more harm to our country and the world as a whole, but only because he used the frustrations of people to his own benefit, and we didn't really see systemic change in terms of the economic inequality. If you look at his tax cuts, that they primarily benefited corporations, and for middle class Americans, these tax cuts were very minimal compared to companies like Amazon, etc. So, how much of this blame?
But you're neglecting wages. You're neglecting the figures I gave you about median household income, and you're neglecting the fact that in the last couple of years, the increases in the income of the bottom 25% were higher than in the top 10%.
But what policy of Donald Trump do you attribute that?
Oh, I don't know. I know it wasn't happening before, and it did happen then. I don't know what caused it. It may be cutting a lot of regulations, which apparently his people did.
I think the problem with his administration to me was, obviously he left a country. I think he left after he left office. If you look at when he took office and after he left office, I think the country was worse off, right? We had 500 to 400,000 COVID cases and the economic repercussions of that. Don't get me wrong, he did do some good stuff, in terms of, working with Democrats in March of 2020 to pass a stimulus check, which I think helped the economy. I give him credit for that. But I think as a whole, because my larger point here is, it seemed to me that he was there in office for himself, right? And he's always been a guy who doesn't really know much, but pretends to, right? And a lot of people were attracted to his personality and what he talked about. I'll give him credit. He was the guy who started talking about trade deals and, the working class plight. And I think a lot of people gravitated to that, like you said. But I also think that because he was there for himself, right? We didn't really see real change, and he ended up kind of, you know, continuing on the old Republican neoconservative policies that I think have led to our economic disparity. Let me know if you disagree or agree with that take.
Yeah, I think you're concentrating too much on policies, politics, and personalities, and not enough on the actual institutional arrangements that aren't always a function of a new federal policy or a new trade deal. And I would like to see more federalism. I would like to see the individual states decide, okay, let California, I'm going to decide we're going to do this. Let South Dakota decide I'm going to do that. And let Utah and Nevada and Arizona make their own decisions. And I'd like to see if some of this works better than others. I think the idea that everything goes to Washington, D.C. is more of a problem at this point than a solution.
Right. So in terms of what you were talking about, like federalism, right? So kind of piggybacking of what you said prior to Ibrahim's question, you were talking about how it's us versus them, and I think that's the biggest thing right now. And I just 100% agree with you that people don't see it. They see it as us versus them, and they don't see it as a unity, or there should be a bridge. And so it seems like progressively, it's just the divide has become more and more disparity, right? So what would you say that the government should do to kind of bridge that and talk to the citizens? Like, this is not okay that there's people going completely head on against each other as if we're in like a cold civil war. And so I don't see it as benefiting us. I don't see it as advancing us as a nation. I do believe there needs to be a bridge. I just don't know when or why politicians don't address it and when they will address it. What do you think on that?
Well, somehow it's not in their interest. And we got to find a way of changing that. We have too much concentration of power. We have, the new tech giants, they have too much power. That they should be treated as common carriers, and they should be subject to more competition and more regulation. That, I think, is part of the story. The individual states should be allowed to go their own way, as they did to some degree in the COVID situation. You have New York versus Florida. Well, they got different results. They had different policies. They got different results. We have California versus South Dakota. Well, they're very different places, but they also got different results. And fine, if people need to move to the places that are getting the better results, more power to them. I think the idea that we're going to solve everything at the federal level, I just don't see it. I don't see it under any party. I don't see it under any president. And the Congress seems to be extremely limp and unable to do much of anything. And that's been so for 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. So how I see it is I attribute, the divide to media pluralism. And in that, we have a CNN and then we have Fox News. And it's like there's no middle ground. And so what people have to do is, or what me and my buddies here try to do, is we dissect information from every side and we just take the information out and try to be objective with it, right? And the problem is that the average person does not want to dissect information. They want to hear it and they want it to be, truth. And so what can we do so we had a professor on the podcast, Professor Lessig, and his solution was that we should utilize these platforms such as podcasts, such as comedy, in order to bridge that divide, because in the media realm is just everything is so drastic because the numbers, people want more drastic information. They want something that seems more out of the ordinary than the truth. And so his solution was we should use podcasts like this, speak to different people, and people can give their 2 cents and not just listen to these news sources. What do you think we should do about this media pluralism?
Well, look, I think that's part of the answer, but of course, it's only part of the answer. And I do the same thing you do. The first thing I get up in the morning, I spend an hour and a half looking around different sites and reading, and before I even get down to work. Most people don't have that much, maybe time or energy to do that. But for those who do, yes, it's very valuable. We would be lost if we didn't have that at this point, no doubt about it. But let me ask another thing. What do you think the role of colleges and universities is, and what do you think it should be? Are you pleased with what you see? Are you wishing it were a little different, or what?
Yeah, personally, I don't think I'm happy with what we're getting. I think a lot of people aren't happy with what we're getting. It just seems things are very one-sided. When you go to a college, whether it's going to be a conservative or liberal college before you go. And it just seems like a lot of professors will either stray towards that path, right? And nonetheless, it's like information is just one-sided and it's just biased versus it being straight information. And it just seems that this has been increasingly adapted into the education system. And I think that's really penalizing a lot of students and a lot of adults in general, because they're not it's like they're not receiving information to decide for themselves where they want to be. It's like information is being fed to them and being told to them where they should be.
So if you could start a new college and you had, $10 billion to start a new college, you had an endowment. Hey, there are plenty of people out there who have $10 billion, and maybe you can convince one.
Right.
What would you do?
I honestly believe it should be very objective. It should be, this is where we are. This is the information we've received in the past. The information we received in the past is, of course, biased, has a biased taste to it, but this is where we are and this is why. And just allow the students to kind of go ahead and dissect the information, because in reality we all come from different experiences, we all come from different lifestyles, right? And so that kind of changes our opinions and our truth, basically. So I think that professors should be there just to give us our information and answer questions as to what we are confused about or what we think should be different, and instead of feeding us information. And because I've had professors in the past who have been very cynical of certain things, and I don't think that cynicism should have been there.
Now,
Or
what's your major?
I'm a business admin major. Yeah. And so especially in some of my philosophy courses, it's like,
Don't tell me that. I'm the chairman.
right. Well, let's move away from that a little bit, but I'll take another example.
No, I would like to know about your philosophy courses, but not by name or anything.
Right. Okay. So, in one of my ethics courses, the professor was quite one-sided with things. And I didn't think that was the best way to do it. I know ethics is typically it's a one-way thing, right? This is right and this is why it's right. But in my opinion, I think that everybody makes a decision based on how they feel. And I think that if they're capable of rationalizing it out, whether it's right or wrong, that could be their truth.
So you're thinking that a professor should help a person articulate his or her value, put them in the form of stateable propositions and arguments. And then when the arguments are out there, people could say, well, it seems to have this strength, or maybe this is an objection, and let 100 flowers bloom.
Well, essentially. Yeah, let the
course
students
an
decide.
Upper division course or a lower division course?
It's an upper division.
I see.
I think going back to your point, Professor, about colleges and why they're so important. I think what's happened in the country is that and again, this is my opinion only. I think there's so much bureaucracy in colleges that
Oh, that is true. Let me tell you, it drives me crazy.
exactly. I mean, it's in my mind, that's a lot. That's part of the reason why college is so expensive, right? Is because
Oh, it is.
universities continue to hire different administrators and bureaucracy after bureaucracy. There's new rules and regulations, and I kind of think that to a certain degree that it helps the students, but to a certain degree it does not. And I think what it does is that you know colleges and universities start to get in the middle of curriculum and what's taught in the classroom, and I think that's a major issue. I mean, for colleges that are liberal like USC, and as a liberal student, I have empathy for students who are conservative, right, and who feel afraid at times to express their opinions and beliefs. And I think that that's something that we need to address if we're going to, build bridges, is understanding, and not to, if we disagree with someone, how can we disagree in a civil way? And I think we should have more classes, specifically in liberal arts, that teach us dialogue and how to disagree, as opposed to just learning about one way of thinking or the other. So I definitely agree with you on that. But I think,
Well, yeah, I would hope my discipline should be good at that, because we have so many different philosophical points of view that have come out in history, and there's so many points of view to be presented. Now, anybody who spends his life doing philosophy will have his own conception of the things that work best and the things that don't, and that's fine. That's how it ought to be. But you really have to have a sense that once you've gone through these courses, you can state your positions intelligibly, honestly, and argue, see where other people are coming from, give them your best arguments, listen to theirs. If you're not learning that, then I'm afraid it's a waste of time.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I want to ask you of a more broader, general question, just a more philosophical question in a sense. And it's regarding what Matt was talking about, and it was, people are getting spoon-fed information. We got Fox News, CNN. It's all about, I'm listening to Fox News. I'm on their side, and anything that's against this information is blasphemy or is wrong, right? And people are not just uh, understanding how to process information and even just go through with it and kind of analyze it for themselves to make their decisions for themselves. On a philosophical level, how do you think, is this like a human thing where we're just, it's better to pick sides and just go with the story, or is it more that it's a generational thing, or that we're doing right now,
I think it's more of a generational thing that we're doing right now.
Mhm.
But of course, it's not as if it's never been done before. It certainly has. Now, there is an approach in political philosophy by a philosopher I knew. He recently died last year. His name is Jerry Gauss. He was at the University of Arizona. He wrote a book for Princeton University Press called The Tyranny of the Ideal. And a great deal of political philosophy throughout history has been trying to articulate an ideal society. And his message was, forget about it. Start with the society you're in. Try to find out as much about it as you can. Develop some hypotheses about the institutions in it, how they're connected to each other, and piecemeal start considering what would count as an improvement that would contribute to the value of the society as a whole. And let different people contend and develop their own models. And if you read that book, then what you're thinking is what we need to, well, one thing that seems to work is if you have a society of people, say it's the four of us, and we have different conceptions of the good. We're not completely different from each other, but we have different perspectives and somewhat different values and so on. And we have to somehow be willing to articulate our ideas to others, give our arguments, and then find a compromise solution that may not be the first choice of any one of us, but the solution we get is for each one of us better than the status quo.
Right.
And we have to find a way, okay, let's agree with that. And now let's see how this changes other aspects of our relationship. And we go on in this way, making incremental progress by each of us has a systematic view. Each of us is willing to compromise aspects of it. And we have the faith, each one of the four of us might have the faith. You know what? I bet if we keep doing this for a period of years, we'll do better than if any one of us were to develop his own theory and follow that through. Because even when I'm disagreeing with you, I think you may have something I'm missing. And so I never want to shut you out. I want to find ways to compromise with you. I'm not giving up my own values, but if we can do that in our institutions, we can make progress. But now it's easier to think about that with four of us than it is with 330 million of us. So that's one of the reasons I like the idea of getting back to state governments and even local governments, even though those governments have not been great in the past either, but they might be more amenable to change. But the reason I focus on college is because the people who think about these things and who go into government at a variety of different levels, if they start thinking in these terms, then we might get institutions that value this kind of interaction that I just sketched, and we can start our way back.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think everybody has their own view, but I think the hard part is the compromise. I feel like in our age, people are not willing to make that compromise to make the incremental changes. And maybe that's, as Matt said, due to media pluralism, people are just saying that side's entire argument's wrong, even though there might be, hints of truth to that argument. But
yeah, and you miss a lot if you're just always making an all or nothing decision.
Right. And the media might be forcing that upon a lot of the American people. So.
And we talk about the media. And what is this media? Those are internet, sometimes national, sometimes international organizations. They operate at a very high level of abstraction, very far from the daily lives of all of us. I think we got to find local media. We got to find local ways of interacting. And it's not think globally, act locally. It's think locally, act locally.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that.
I think also, like you said about local power, I believe in the power of local newspapers, and that needs to be revived.
Oh God, yes.
I mean, local journalism is dying, and that's,
it sure is.
It's very sad because local journalism used to be something that everybody agreed, nobody thought it had a bias, right? They gave it to you like it is, and we respected local journalists. And I don't know, I think the government should do a better job of subsidizing, and maybe state governments can do it, or counties can. But I don't see the business model of local journalism surviving. So I think it has to become some sort of a government-supported entity, because I really do think we need to revive it.
If we could get Zuckerberg and Bloomberg and a few of these others, they could have enough resources to put money in that. Now, I don't think that's what they're interested in, but there's a lot of there's a lot of money out there. And if it were put to the right use, and it's not just a matter of buying things. I mean, but still, you've got to start small and be willing to live with that. Think, I'm not going to change the world. You know that? I want to change this little corner of it. I want to be involved with others who do.
Right. I think I do want to I want to touch on something that I think we haven't yet, and I think it's a little important because going back to, like, what Jenish was saying and what you've been saying, in terms of, and I think all of us, four of us, agree that we need to do a better job of understanding the position of others, right? Not just
Yeah.
label put each other in boxes. 'Cause I think once we put people in boxes, that's when we lose it. So in understanding your view, you in 2016, you and other philosophers actually signed on a letter supporting the candidacy of Donald Trump, and I'm really interested by that. You received a lot of criticism, right? I mean, you teach at USC; it's a liberal campus, so uh, and obviously, I want to understand. A lot of people, have this view of this typical Trump supporter, right? I mean, when you imagine someone who's supporting Trump, you don't imagine an MIT graduated, world-renowned philosopher like you, right? And why? It's a kind of a two-part question, but first, why? What do you think? What do you find appealing about Donald Trump? And second, why do you think that there is this misconception of the Trump supporter? Do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, I think uh, I thought both parties in the United States were failing.
Hmm.
I thought there was very little hope within the Democratic Party of getting somebody who would turn it around because they had become kind of lockstep and ideological. The Republican Party was still just a coalition of people, a variety of views, and they would sometimes do this and sometimes do that. But our politics was so polarized that there was no other Republican who could fight the battles that needed to be fought, I thought. And that is what appealed to me. Now, at first, I thought he was too much of a dirty fighter, because I was favoring some other candidates first, and he blew them away in ways that I thought were, well, not entirely on the up and up. But I thought the man has energy. He does seem to be attracting the right kind of people. Like I say, I think middle class and working class people have not gotten a good deal in the past 4 decades. And he seemed to be speaking to them. And I thought that nobody else really was. The other thing is, he had this view. He didn't have the typical Republican view of free trade, and it doesn't matter who gets out of work because of that, and there's going to be, it's going to lift the whole world up together. I didn't think that. I didn't think he didn't want to do that, and I liked that he didn't want to do it. The other thing is, he was a critic of our constant involvement in foreign wars. And look, the American people do not want to be involved everywhere. They do not want to be the world's policeman. Now, there may not be any other good policeman out there, but we weren't the greatest policemen either. So all of those things I thought were perfectly legitimate issues. But I thought that they needed somebody who would just go tooth and nail. So he did. And I think for the first 2-3 years, the results were good.
Do you, and just a quick follow up on that, like you said, I mean, I think on both sides of the political aisle, there's kind of a growing sense of agreement that to re-examine the role of the United States in foreign affairs, right? And like I said before about the effects of trade deals, but after 4 years of Trump, do you think he did more good for the country or bad, especially after the January 6th insurrection that happened? I mean,
oh, well, yeah. I mean, I don't think it was an insurrection, because I think an insurrection is an attempt to overthrow the government by violent means. And none of the people who were arrested even were armed inside the Capitol. So I think that's an example of a misuse of language to shut down discussion, more than to open up discussion.
Okay, well, I have to touch base on that point again. I mean, okay, listen, I mean, I'm trying to understand your perspective here. To me, like you said, an insurrection is people going in with the intention of overthrowing the government. I mean, we all saw the videos of supporters destroying the Capitol building, essentially, barging their way through. I mean, they used violent language. Obviously, some of them were not armed, but
No, none of them were armed. None of the people were arrested were armed.
still, like their intention was to overthrow the government. I mean,
No, you're not going to go into the government and think you're going to overthrow the government if you don't even have a firearm on you. My God,
but they were
that's
saying
idiotic.
they hang Mike Pence. I mean, they were saying all those things. People had
Oh, yeah, people say bad stuff. They do say bad stuff.
But here's what I don't get, Professor, and I'm really genuinely trying to understand your perspective here. If, let's say, Barack Obama was in power, right, and he would have done, and his supporters would have done this, do you think you would have had the same response here?
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, if you, I disagree with not calling this an insurrection, because what I think that does is that lowers the bar. I mean, I'll tell you this.
The bar was pretty much lowered with the whole Russiagate thing.
I mean, you think so. Listen, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think here's my perspective on this, right? I mean, I come from a country, Pakistan, right? And it's basically a banana republic where the most important element that's destroyed the country is nobody respects election integrity. And everybody thinks that the other side stole the election. And I think Donald Trump really kind of is responsible for destroying bringing up this idea of election integrity, because we don't have any voter fraud in the country systemically. There's no evidence of that. Bill Barr concluded that there was no evidence.
No, I disagree with you. I think there is evidence. And I think when people say there's no evidence, they're saying there's no proof. But there can be evidence which falls short of proof. And I think that's where we are today.
But Professor, here's the thing. I need to push back against you on this little point here. There was so many different investigations done by state governments. The state government,
very few actually, and some of them are continuing. And some of the audits that are continuing should continue. So let's see what turns up.
Well, listen, here's the Arizona audit. To me, is very comical. I mean, I don't think they're going to find any, but I think we'll disagree. I don't think we'll
fine. If they don't find any, all the better. Then that will be settled. But let it go forward.
No, I'm all for open investigations. That's fine.
Well, yeah, but the other side, the Democratic Party is, and the Department of Justice is opposing it. They're not saying let it go forward. They're saying no.
I mean, they have a reason to say. I mean, it's been now 8 months of constant back and forth on this. I mean, Republican administration.
You know how long legal issues take to resolve? They take a long time.
Sure. I mean, but the thing is, this is kind of just, if you find the evidence, you present it, and nobody's found the evidence yet. I mean, I think we'll disagree on this point, but that's fine. But I think I want to ask you, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to ask you about, going back to my point about personality. Do you genuinely think that Donald Trump didn't do any harm to our democratic institutions? I mean, he criticized the FBI, the CIA, and obviously.
I think the FBI was seriously deficient.
Right, but my point is that
my son was in the FBI for a part of that time.
Right, but do you think that some of his criticism of our democratic institutions, his insulting of just democratic principles was good for the country? Do you place any blame on him for that?
I'm not aware of democratic principles which he insulted.
I mean, this idea of the freedom of the press. I mean, he was very much against that. I mean,
wait a minute. Was he the one who stopped the reporting on Hunter Biden's laptop?
Well, no, listen, I am the type of liberal which will say we need to investigate everything that I mean, Hunter Biden seems like a very, fishy person. What he's done is just terrible. I mean, he's used nepotism to its full extent, right? He's an incompetent person. I agree with you on that. But I mean, he's a former drug addict as well, so I have some sympathies for him in that regard. But Professor, I mean, like, he destroyed this whole idea of an independent free press. I mean, he attacked
Wait
reporters
a
who
minute.
asked tough questions. I
He
mean,
criticized the press.
I mean,
It's fine to criticize the press. It's fine for the press to criticize politicians.
it's absolutely.
Was there some law passed?
It wasn't. I agree with you on that. But I think the president has a moral responsibility, right, to uphold those conventional principles, don't you think?
I think he was okay. He had his point of view. He expressed it. Other people expressed theirs. I don't think he's impolite. Okay, he's impolite.
I think I think you're being very lenient on him, and that's all right. I mean, I don't want to stretch those questions out. But my last question on this subject is, on a very serious and fundamental level, do you think 4 years of Trump, after, and this includes the COVID crisis, was the country better off when Trump left, or as a whole, how do you assess his whole entire administration, all 4 years?
I think for the first 3, it was much better off. And I think after COVID, it went down the drain.
Okay, gotcha. I think there is a fundamental argument to be made that the first 2 years, produce economic productivity, and like you said about the median wages going up, although I don't really attribute that to Trump as much. But I think again, like, I really have to emphasize my point about personality and being in politics for the right reasons. I think because he was in it for the wrong reasons, in my opinion, he mishandled COVID, because he again perceived of these national problems. The COVID was basically a pandemic, an entire war, as something to further his own candidacy in 2020. And he kind of failed to recognize that he's a president for the entire country, not just the states that he voted for. And I think the Republican Party, if they use some of his principles, right, of helping the working class and others, and re-examining the U.S. role in foreign
See,
affairs,
that's a big step for the Republican Party.
absolutely. I think that's.
Because they had never done that.
I think we're in the middle of a very big shift in politics, where the Democratic Party has kind of, switched gears. The Democratic Party was always the party of the working class, and the Republicans have made it that. So I give Trump some credit for that. Absolutely, he deserves it. But I don't think he's the right guy. Do you think he's the right guy to lead the party?
Well, I don't know that he's the right guy. I think there are other people as well. But I do think we're in some serious, difficult years until the next 2 elections. And I think we could face problems which make last year look pretty good.
Right. Well, I'll let my other 2 co-hosts jump in here.
Okay.
All right. So I'm not one to push like political questions, and I'm very much libertarian moderate myself. So I'd rather just kind of go back to a question of philosophy. So a question that I've always been very intrigued with is that, okay, it seems as if, like, I believe the statistic was about 90% of all philosophers were a believer in religion in some way. They believe in a higher source of power. And I believe, personally myself, I do believe there's a higher source of power. What do you think on that? Do you think that religion has to do with philosophy, and how do you think that's connected?
Yeah, I do think that religion and philosophy have been closely connected, and there's a reason for them to be closely connected. I do think, in terms of the quote you made, 90% think there's a higher power. I don't know what group that was. The people I've spent my time with in philosophy for 40 years, very few believe in any sort of higher power or God. And I'm talking about the people at MIT, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, and that sort of place, even USC to a large extent. As far as the connection goes.
Sorry, just to interrupt you real quick. The 90%, that was as like a whole, right? From Socrates to Nietzsche.
Oh,
and then
I see.
Yeah.
I thought you meant the people today who were doing philosophy.
No, sorry, as a whole. I should have been more clear.
Yeah, well, that there were more than 50%. If you ever look at Mud Hall, the Mud Hall of Philosophy, you will see a bunch of names going around the building, and they are meant to be philosophers, though they're not really all philosophers. But there are some names that are missing, and one name in particular is David Hume. And why isn't his name up there? He's really one of the great philosophers of all time. Because the people who built Mud Hall were religious. And David Hume was a great opponent of religion. But the other names up there, they were not opponents. So yes, in that respect, I can see where your percentage is coming from. What's the connection between the two? The connection between the two, I think, has to do with what counts as living a good and meaningful life, finding a sense of purpose. And that's something that, for example, Socrates and Plato were very concerned with. Now, religion didn't play a big part in Plato or Socrates, but the idea of there being a sense of human purpose did. And then, of course, in the Christian era, Christianity basically, for a long time, kind of took over that meaning and purpose part of life, and philosophy kind of let that drift for a while and concentrated on other things. But now we're in an era which might well be, I don't know if it is yet, it might well be a post-Christian era. And the West, people in the West, each of us needs some sense of purpose in our lives. And we need to be able to answer some question of what do we really value and what do we really want from our life? How do we want to feel when it ends? How can we face the fact that it ends? This has always been a central part of both religion and philosophy. And I think it's a very natural connection. Now, if you read the journals in philosophy today, you don't see a lot of that. You see some, but you don't see very much. You see a lot of the more theoretical end of things. But it's still part of our concern.
Yeah, I noticed that philosophy is getting more secular and less, about religion and purpose. And kind of, on that note, what do you think the future of philosophy is? Especially with the advent of neuroscience, artificial intelligence, these large computational innovations that we have. How do you see the future of philosophy as a whole? Just with
I see philosophers in the future getting much more involved with each of those things you mentioned, to understand what they really are and perhaps what their limitations are as well. And in order to do that, philosophers are going to have to become as well educated in the theory of computation and neuroscience and all that as they are in philosophy. But I think you'll see that happening in the next 20 years.
Yeah.
On that note, I think it's a good segue to end the conversation. Professor Scott Soames, thanks so much for your time. Again, I think this is really important to have these discussions with people you disagree with, and I think you provide a valuable
No, I enjoyed it, and I think there should be great if there were more things like this.